It's great to be here today with both of you. Welcome to the Communities Medicine Podcast with Brooklyn Psychedelic Society. It's my first time joining this podcast, and I'm thrilled to be here with these two amazing people. I work closely with them wearing different hats in the psychedelic space, and it's really a beautiful moment finding the synergy and having this opportunity to bring us all together. And I'm the director of operations here at BPS. I joined the team back in June. And so a little bit about me, I'm former executive director of Dance Safe. I also am adjunct professor and subject matter expert in the Master's in Public Health program at SUNY Potsdam, and I mentor with the New York State Public Health Corps. And I'm a doctoral student of public health at Emory-Rollins School of Public Health on the implementation evaluation science track. And where my focus is on advancing the field of psychedelic public health, which brings me to my last role, which is co-founder of the Center for Psychedelic Public Health and where and how I met Logina. So I'm so grateful to have you both here. And I was wondering, Colin, maybe we could start with you. I think community knows you pretty well, but in the organization you represent, but share a little bit more about yourself and how and why you got into the work that you do.
Sure. Thanks, Missy. And it's good to have you joining us, Logina, as well. Thanks for coming on. I think most of the community knows me. I'm Colin Pugh, Executive Director of BPS. I've been organized in BPS since 2015 when I was 24. So it's been a hot minute. I got into this space. I think a lot of people know how I've shared quite often, wrote about it, that I lost a close friend in a tragic manner, and I had a revelatory experience in MDMA after he passed that was quite cathartic and therapeutic in a way I was not anticipating. And so after he passed, I began to wonder and wish if he had had a similar encounter with it, if he'd still be alive. So that is how I got into this space. That's how I became like an internal advocate, I would say. And then I moved to New York City in 2014, where my friend was last alive, and I just loved New York City. I'm from Syracuse, New York, upstate, which is
Upstate.
also where Missy's from, actual upstate to our fellow New Yorkers listening. And yeah, I've been organizing for about 10 years, and around 2020, 5 years ago, I had a vision for community-based psychedelic cooperatives and healing centers, and incorporated BPS as a nonprofit in 2021. And yeah, and I will pass the mic to Legina.
Great. Hello. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. My name is Logina Mostafa. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm a community organizer based in Brooklyn. As Missi shared, I work with the Center for Psychedelic Public Health. I've been a fellow for the last couple of months, which has been incredible opportunity to finally work at the intersection of psychedelics and public health. I have my master's in public health from NYU School of Global Public Health, where I focused on equity and access to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. It's been about 4 years now since I earned that degree, and since then I started a community organization, Queering Existentialism, which is a connection and education initiative. My mission statement is co-creating spaces for the exchange of liberating ideas and cultivating communal secure attachment. And psychedelics are a really significant part of the work I do, which I'll share more on later. I'm also a member of the Psychedelic Alliance for Healing Justice under the POC Psychedelic Collective and a member of the Arab Psychedelic Society. So yeah,
Busy.
all of them intersect in such beautiful ways. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here. Um, I know, a major component of all of our roles involve a level of community building and psychedelic community building. And so I'm wondering, what does this mean to the both of you, psychedelic community building?
I could go. I am in an interesting spot because I feel like it's changed a bit for me from where I started because like a lot of it was very grassroots and like organizing a lot of in-person events, which we still do, but I don't do as much individually anymore because I've in 2015 when BPS started, it was a much different environment for psychedelics. Even though it was only 10 years ago, which I guess is a solid chunk of time, psychedelics were still very much more taboo then, and so there wasn't many spaces or places to just even meet and gather and talk about psychedelics as there are now. So it really felt in 2015 like there was a kind of vital resource being provided. And now, as we become a nonprofit and it's become like a professional job and org, in addition to doing local community organizing, I also see a lot of my work as like working and talking to other community leaders and other society leaders around the country, and also just trying to rally different groups and people around the idea of a community-based ecosystem and vision for the psychedelic space. So I feel like my focus has shifted a bit over time, and I'm still like understanding that as I learn and grow as a nonprofit leader, because it is in fact my first rodeo. It's my first time leading a nonprofit and org, and it's been a real like blessing to be able to do the work, and I'm grateful for it. But I think I'm more focused on like how to organize different actors in the eco on an ecosystem level and what kind of needs are there for the ecosystem to hopefully emerge in a robust manner.
All right. Um, Colin, is there anything else you wanted to add?
I I mean I want to yap about other in addition yes and eventually yes, but I'd love to hear your response to that, Legina, as a community organizer.
Yeah, for sure. So, psychedelic community building. I would say, for me, um, as someone who focused on psychedelics during my MPH program at a time when there was only one other person in my program who was also focused on psychedelics, it was a bit isolating. And I think that when I accidentally found out about Horizons a few years back and then found this whole world of psychedelic organizations and community, it was so exciting. And I did find over time, though, that so I'm Egyptian and I'm queer, and in I was kind of finding community in ways where I could finally talk about this one taboo area of my healing journey, but I wasn't experiencing as much intersectionality as I would have wished, especially with, sharing such at times really vulnerable stories or not feeling understood because people didn't have shared experience around me, and kind of seeing like all these other spaces where psychedelics were being used frequently, but not um, with, um, with the insight that I've learned from Indigenous practices and attending ceremonies and all these things that I found through the psychedelic community with a capital C, in the mainstream sense. So I think for me, it's been taking everything I've learned from, like, I think, so going back to what psychedelic community means, I think intersectionality around all the identities that we're bringing to our psychedelic experiences is so key. And my work has included creating spaces that really center that in my experience. And we need, like, it's like one huge web, but we do need all of these little pockets that serve different people with different needs at different points in the process and awareness around psychedelics and their journeys. So I think, um, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think you both touch on two really important things that resonated with me. And I feel like it's around the bringing people together around this kind of shared sense of being and purpose. And Legina, you also talked about this like belonging and this shared identity. And I think that community building is both a process and an outcome. And it's interesting, I found in my experience in psychedelic community building, which I'm sure both of you can resonate with, is despite the collective nature of psychedelics, there's still a layer that's very individualistic, or the communities within the space feel like very disjointed at times. And so I think, bringing people together creating, strengthening, sustaining relationships amongst people who share the same common goals or experiences to form a supportive network, you'd think that it would be a lot easier in our psychedelic space. But I think that there's so many different types of people and identities and vulnerabilities, and it's really hard to create spaces that are, whether it's physical, digital, social, where people feel connected, valued, and empowered to contribute. And so I think finding those commonalities and being able to practice like real empathy and really being able to like let go of your ego and realize when you're community building, like everyone has value and purpose at the table. I think you're able to like bridge more gaps and bring community together a lot more and just empower one another to feel a part of the community and that really shared collective capacity to take action. So I think you both touched on two really big pieces of community building, psychedelic community building.
Yeah, if I could, I really agree. And on like a theoretical-ish level, like
We
I
love
do
theories
think,
for public health.
yeah, I I've been always gnawing at the question of like what does psychedelic community mean? And I think it's evolving. And I think the more clearly that can be defined, the better, because I think in my experience in like the 2015 era of psychedelic organizing, back in my day, um, a lot of the utility I would say of psychedelic community was like kind of mainly for education and for like just meeting people, like fellowship and education. And what I'm hearing from what Logina is sharing, and I've also experienced in community organizing more recently, is that especially with the proliferation of research output and societal acceptance of psychedelics, that these community spaces are actually kind of going through an evolution of being just educational and fellowship focused to actually like space holding for people as they pursue whether it's healing, transformation, just insight into their lives, spiritual experiences, or just aesthetic, creative enjoyment. And I think you named it, Misty, that there is such a plurality of uses um, for psychedelics. And and when I'm usually sharing the community-based approach to sympathetic supporters or donors, I say like humans have been doing psychedelics in community for a long time, which I think is true. We have anthropological evidence of that. But also an interesting challenge is that I think a lot of those community settings where psychedelics were being done were embedded in a relatively local, homogenous cultural setting. And so
Mm.
the challenge I see is I do think I'd be curious to hear, Legina, how you understand psychedelic community. Not that I think there's like a singular definition, but I think the challenge is like defining what psychedelic community means and the role it has, and also how to create something to commune around in a pluralistic environment and not just in addition to the important differences of ethnic background or identities or orientations or gender, like so many of those, and also the plurality of what is bringing people to explore psychedelics. Is it healing? Is it transformation? Are they looking for connection? Is it all of the above? So I think there's both this kind of like a interesting intersectional identity question that Logina brought up of what the psychedelic community is, and also the kind of intentionality of the community. Because I think there's a huge opportunity here in these communities. Like actually we hold space for people as they go about these processes in a way distinct from a more potentially medical or clinical approach. But anyways, I'm curious what Legina, what you think, and Missy on like what psychedelic community means as like a concept.
Mhm. I really appreciate all that you raised, and I would love to jump in. The first thing I want to bring up is like, right, psychedelic communities are not happening in isolation. and looking at what's happening on a national level, like looking at what's happening globally and um, all, issues that are coming up around um, like think about like cancel culture or like what does restorative justice look like or all of these different identities and like different potential schisms and that tie into people's intentionality around why they're coming to psychedelics. I mean, I think that communities, and I'll talk more about communal secure attachment later, but community is such an important part of integration because going through, like, for me, my own personal reasons were a mix of personal healing and then also, from interest in harm reduction and excitement around the potentiality of psychedelics to address so many of the mental health challenges that are valid responses to, a sick society, that one would say. And I think I realized I came into the space as someone with a political background, and I realized naively, like, oh, I'm upholding psychedelic exceptionalism, or I'm going off of the book, the anthology Psychedelic Justice from Shakruna talks about, right, like what is the history we're building on around like if everyone was dosed with LSD, the world would be a better place or something. So I think that I was like, oh, this is very political to me, and I realized how different that was for around like regarding these larger spaces. And I think every space plays a role, like gathering people and then branching off. Because my first workshops as queer and existentialism were psychedelics and social transformation, or so and realizing like it takes time to dig through and identify that, but asking those questions as someone is looking for their specific psychedelic community within the community at large is really important.
You touched on something. Oh, I just want to share that it's interesting. You came to psychedelics from policy, and I came from community. And it was interesting when I realized how political it was and just substances and medicines were in general, that I think from a community perspective, a lot of us that live in community, work in community, function in community, we all have this aha moment, at least in the community health space, where we realize that we can only do so much. Like we hit this wall because we realize that policy actually shapes everything that we do, but we can move that by bringing community together and mobilizing community. And so I love how we kind of flip-flop, like you came from policy and I came from community and we landed here together. But I think, both of you touch on um, a lot around psychedelic community. And I think even to make it more complex, like there's even more complexities because I think we even need to like remove psychedelic and talk about what is community, like defining community. And it's like it can be so granular. And then you add, psychedelic element on top of it. Because I mean, community can be like there's different types of communities, right? Like, I mean, for starters, it can be a social group, it can be a sense of connection amongst a group of people. It can be based on geography. It can be based on identity. It can be based on interests, practices. It can be virtual. It can be in person. And I mean, you can share values and goals, or you have mutual support, or so you share space. So there's so many like different types of communities. And then you add the layer of psychedelic and why people come to the space. And I think that, that adds a whole nother complexity when we talk about psychedelic community. So it's like when you think about what is community and what does that mean to you? I think if we asked everyone, they might have a little bit of a different answer. So I'm curious, like, what is community? And to you guys, what does it mean to both of you?
Um, okay, so I think this is such a great question. Um, and this word gets thrown around a lot and is co-opted at different times, because I think we need to protect what it means. And my most simple answer would be community is where we don't have to choose between attachment and authenticity.
Mm.
And I have, I think, yeah, um, that has been the case for me in my journey as someone who like has been kind of drawn to questioning things or kind of these like taboo pathways to healing. And um, I think about what does it mean to have a community as a space that's reciprocal, where we're showing up in both giving and receiving, and what is there's a sense of sustainability and mutual aid. And I think that also it's really culturally informed. Like I grew up, I was born in Egypt and raised in the US between New York City and Iowa, and all these places had different subcultures and perceptions around community. And I was used to this, I was like, how do I bridge this very like collectivist approach and this individualistic approach and different levels of interdependence, enmeshment, and hyper individualism, which is where the communal secure attachment idea came to be, which is community level interdependence, or like I think it's a spectrum of when like healthy versus not so healthy iterations of community that can either like reinforce growth and positivity and like healthiness and versus ways that can inhibit that. And we are mycelial beings at the end of the day. So I think as a lot of institute right now, bringing it back up to a larger level as certain institutions are crumbling. We see like SNAP benefits are being cut off soon. Like it's time for community, I think, to step up, which is a local space of creating systems of care and reciprocity and redistributing resources. And that's looking at ecology and mycelium, right? That's how things can function most optimally and synergistically. So that was a very broad.
Wow, so much great stuff you
Follow
just
that
shared
up. No.
there. So,
What does
yeah.
community mean to you?
Well, I just wanted to also respond and share, or just like reflect on what Logina just shared. I thought that was a really great share, especially well, the first part. Well, when you started talking about like mutual aid and mutual support, there's this really kind of tight idea I've heard from different people who think about like cooperative approaches to society, and it goes something along the lines of when the public sector isn't providing for its citizenry and the private sector isn't providing for its citizenry, the mutualist sector or the community sector kind of starts providing because there's a need there. And um, it's really refreshing and cool to hear from you, Lugina, about it because I feel like you're very on the ground with queer and existentialism and your social justice and political justice awareness and spaces that you're in, that you're kind of seeing it firsthand. And I'd be curious also to hear more about how you see community, perhaps more broadly, but I think more interestingly, specifically, psychedelic community and social transformation. Because just how I tend to think of it is that, um, and like what you were saying of like, how do I reconcile? Were you saying that it was a more collectivist kind of aura or vibe, vibe, that word we all love to use in Egyptian culture as a and distinction from like New York and Iowan culture, that it felt more individualistic here, which I can imagine.
Um, yeah, I mean, especially in Iowa, I think in New York City, I found my pockets, and I realized that all of these things are happening on a spectrum, and the attachment of a community is based on the different relationships within that. But all these things are adaptive based on how much access people have to abundance and attunement. Um, so public health. Yeah, I can hand it back over.
Yeah, because how I kind of understand it, and maybe from a very like armchair anthropologist, public health person, or I think of it as that like community does not come naturally to a lot of people in America. Like American culture is very individualistic, as we all know. And I think that's one of the interesting challenges and potential fruits of community-based approaches, especially in the psychedelic space. I think more broadly, we need a community-based approach to kind of everything, but I do think psychedelic communities have a unique potential role to play where they can help loosen the sinews of an overly individualistic approach to doing stuff and supporting each other. And I think you mentioned like cancel culture and restorative justice, and I think that's a really interesting lane to go down, or that I've thought of before, because I do think my kind of theory of like why we see so much of that is like people want alternatives to the more medicalized, regulated, dare I say, capitalist approach to stop it psychedelics. uh People want an alternative to that, but I also think that we are so embedded in like throwaway culture and an carceral culture where we just like put people in prison or just like throw them away, that I think sometimes a lot of the same mentalities that are affecting society at large, like putting people in prison, is recapitulating itself with cancel culture and not actually approaching things in a restorative justice way, because it involves doing things that are different and uncomfortable for how we've been trained in this kind of like classical liberal idea of the autonomous individual, right? And so that way of thinking needs to be like we need to like learn our way out of through practice, I think. And I do think the psychedelic space could be a real I always thought of it could be like the front of a cultural or like up there on the cultural change movement or like the caboose because there's so much more instability and chaos at times, as we know, in the psychedelic space from people's states and traumas they're coming with as well. As it's a very complex space, but I do think like conflict is to community like weeds are to a garden. Like they're going to happen. And if you just like rip out weeds, you get, and this is a parable from a Bible passage there, I say, but like if you rip out weeds, you risk also ripping out the good parts of that garden. And so it's got to be done with like care and thoughtfulness and recognition that we all have different traumas and difficulties. But anyways, the long story short, I'm curious your thoughts on like social transformation, Logina, and like, because how I understand it is that we can practice community in the psychedelic space. And with these medicines, it might potentially be like a petri dish for inculcating a communitarian approach as opposed to a more autonomous, hegemonic way we think of things, if that makes sense.
I just have to plug real quick.
Please.
We don't have restorative justice in the space because the drug war is a race war. And so until we can all have that conversation, we're not going to have restorative justice. Hand the mic to Logina.
You so much for bringing that up. I mean, I think looking at like inner looking at psychedelic justice and intersectionality, and if we're not, if the, and part of the reason I didn't, when I started querying existentialism, I didn't put psychedelics in the name because I was like, I want to create bridges between these different progressive movements and spaces that I'm a part of, because if someone doesn't have access, someone goes through a transformational psychedelic experience, but they don't have access to housing, food, shelter, they're being impacted right by these systems, then they're stuck in a feedback loop and it's environmental. So I think the psychedelic community or movement at large needs to be doing more intersectional work. And I think that's where public health and psychedelic public health, and bringing up the social determinants of health and how that impacts psychedelics is such a critical part of this conversation, and why I'm so happy the Center for Psychedelic Public Health is in existence now, and we're fundraising and really gaining traction. And I would tie that back as well. To I wanted to share some work that I did in Alaska earlier this year, with the Center for Psychedelic Public Health, which was advocating for the Alaska Natural Medicine Act. And in that environment, I found myself, working with indigenous groups and working with veterans and working with, you know, um, people who were in the military coming up from different parts of the country, coming up from Texas, people who I never thought I would be in a space with, just hanging out from my history of like political organizing and progressive spaces. And here we were coming together, having shared heart-centered conversations about cognitive liberty and justice and love and intersectionality. And I think that gave me a lot of hope, specifically being in that environment, especially at this highly divisive time where, it is especially like amplified by social media, and this binary system. Like I was like, wow, psychedelics really created a bridge that broke through. I'm quickly just going to talk about the default mode network and entropic brain theory across
Yeah.
the logical model. Because, and just for a little bit of context, like psilocybin in the brain interrupts entrenched patterns of thought, like a hill of snow and like sled pathways down, and that's why introducing that entropy can be so beneficial for depression, anxiety, OCD, etc. And if we take that across the socio-ecological model, which is a public health model that starts with like individual, interpersonal, community, societal, then we see these entrenched pathways of doing things in society that are causing adverse effects on that level that we're all feeling. I think psychedelics can, from that grassroots place, can ripple out in that way and bring entropy that we need as a society to shift these systems that are not working, that are, creating this greater divisiveness and this class war that is we're all feeling at this time. That's coming to a boiling point. So that does give me a lot of hope at this time. And yeah, I wanted to share that.
Yeah, and I think I love that you brought up two big things in relation to Colin's question around social transformation. And it was social determinants of health and the socio-ecological model. And when we talk about social transformation, like if we can change and improve all of those things, and then your relationship with the world around you and the people, having that human connection and transforming all those societal elements, we'd see much greater health outcomes and happiness and more connected community. So I love that you brought up both of those things in terms of social transformation. Colin, what about you? Social transformation through psychedelics. Like what's your thoughts on that? Like how do we reach that? Like what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I actually have, it sounds like I might have a different
Love it.
way
Hit
of thinking
it.
about it.
Yeah.
Because here's how I appreciate, and I think there is absolute necessity and need for approaches that fuse social justice and orientation and challenging the drug war and being conversant with psychedelics. But I actually think, and I'm gonna throw a different opinion out here, that it actually that though that there's a role for that part of the ecosystem in the community space, but I actually would be I think it needs to be the epicenter of it, and I'll give a reason why. Is that the real opportunity here, in my opinion, of for psychedelic community and psych is to actually create a mutualized, community-owned mental health care system
Mm.
as a viable alternative to the medical model. And the challenge with bringing in all these other aspects of society into that is that if people are just like depressed and on TikTok stewing and brain rotting, they're like, look, I can either spend $2,000, 3,000 bucks at this Oregon retreat center, or I can go to this local psychedelic community, but they also have to be aligned politically with all these other things that are virtuous, reasonable causes. It can be very hindering to the community-based model to actually standing up on its own legs to be a robust alternative to the clinical medical model. So I actually, to play devil's advocate, I think there is actually a reason for, I don't want to say censorship, but I think more like discernment of what spaces and where these more broader questions are brought in. Because if someone is just struggling with drinking or addiction or drug use, or they're just depressed, they should be able to also get like safe, reliable, affordable peer support, and also not necessarily have to talk about their opinions or thoughts on the drug war or the race war or all that. And I think there's justice involved in actually keeping things where they need to, like, separate, so that actually a more broad movement can potentially unfold and we can have a community owned ecosystem that has room for those conversations, I think. But I would hesitate to have it be a centering aspect of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think I have to process it and sit with it outside of everything I've like been known in terms of like the social elements and what impacts someone's, depression or health or well-being. Um, I'm totally hearing your perspective, and it's always great to think about different perspectives. I think that's how we grow as people and in this space. Legina, you're on the edge of your seat.
Um, okay. I just wanted to sh share that like there are different ways of being informed and taking intersectionality and the impact of these systems into account without, literally sitting, I'm not saying that you're saying this, Colin, but like literally sitting someone down and like having it be a focal point of conversations constantly. I think that, from a public health policy perspective, the way that we design certain spaces or integrate different kinds of interventions or education is can be strategic and can be meeting people where they're at in a way that addresses how people are coexisting in an ecosystem and how maybe unchecked internalized white supremacy is going to impact the safety of or like the comfortability of someone else being able to seek care in a particular way. So like what does cultural competency look like and how does that, you know, how do you have processes to call people in as things arise? I think it can be a lot more discreet and multifaceted. And also my most recent Substack article, Who's at the Edge of the Circle, talks about one of those things being psychedelics, being like who isn't in the space, who isn't accessing care, and what support and what bridges in do we need to create from an organizational level approach in order to address these different needs in different spaces, and how is like leadership or the people who are informing these approaches, like taking that into account from their own like lived experiences. And people are not a monolith, so acknowledging that things are inevitably messy and things will happen. And that's part of healing-centered harm reduction, which is a framework from the harm reduction femmes and this incredible book, Bodily Autonomy, Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use. Like, how do we acknowledge the inevitability and also doing everything that we can and being really clear about what community can provide? In my restorative justice facilitation I've been doing with different community spaces, that seems to be another focal point, and that like clarity and being really upfront around like what work are you doing as an individual as you're showing up in this space, and how does that impact those around you? Because it's not happening in isolation. And I've seen some really beautiful conversations had with people from different backgrounds when we're coming together around like the shared values around a community, and having protocols and processes and lots of spreadsheets, of course.
Yeah. And I think, you kind of brought it back to the community piece. And, really, that's why we're here talking today, because, Global Psychedelic Week's theme for day one on Monday is Global Community Day. And I think that we've talked a lot about community being so intimate in a way, like we're connected on this local level, or because we share specific values or specific identities or geographical location. And so I'm thinking about this whole concept of global community and Global Community Day. And it made me think about just psychedelic societies and Colin specifically, like we function at BPS and, Legina in New York, like in such a small community. But Colin, you're really part of such a bigger, you've been part of such a bigger, large global community. And so I'm curious what it's like being part of such a large global community versus so much smaller and grassroots. Because global psychedelic societies are interesting because it's like they're so grassroots in heart and nature, but it's global at the same time. So just curious, like your perspective on what it's been like to be such part of such a large global community, and like tell us what it's really takes to start and sustain a psychedelic society and be part of that larger network and that smaller local network.
Sure. That second part is a different hat. I wish I had a wizard's hat to complement your awesome hat.
Colleen, I should have sent the memo.
Attention to detail with the memos. So on the global community thing, I'm also going to have an unorthodox opinion, perhaps, but um, I I don't know if Legina might have mentioned this, and I do think the community word is used quite a bit, but we don't really always know what exactly we're referring to. And um, I like your definition, Logina, of where you don't need it's like showing up authentically and would you mind repeating it that authentically and
Where you don't have to choose between attachment and authenticity.
yeah, I like that. And the thing is, I think psychedelic societies were a bit of an emergent movement. Emergent, as you guys probably know, but just for our listeners, that it wasn't really like planned top down, but like very grassroots, bottom up. Like people just wanted places to talk about psychedelics in the early 2010s. And so they gathered. And what's interesting about being a part of a global psychedelic network, and to be totally honest, I haven't participated in a ton of like meetings with GPS. I used to. They were I found them very helpful and valuable at a certain time in my organizing career. But I've noticed that a lot of, I think, community and society leaders are still kind of asking, oh, shoot, did we just lose? Okay. A lot of community and society leaders, I think, are asking, like, well, what is the role of societies and communities now? And the reason I'm sharing that, because it harkens back to kind of a theory of what community is that communities usually need to have shared norms and values and practices. And I think they need to acknowledge differences within the community, to Logina's point. There's this really great book from the 90s, I think, called Beating a Different Drum. And it talks about the four stages of community. And it's like, I don't think it's like a sociological work, but it says like the first stage is actually pseudo community. The second stage is chaos. The third stage is emptiness. And the fourth stage is true community. And the reason they call it pseudo community is that people are usually just so enthralled and excited to find other people like them with similar interests that that kind of excitement and newness of it carries a lot of the sense of the community, because it's like, oh wow, I didn't know there was other people who were interested in psychedelics like me, and that has value. But the idea of where pseudo, and I think this harkens to Legina's point about authenticity and attachment, is that there's actually different views and positions and reasons within the community, and the author says that I think it's M. Scott Peck that the longer we go in pseudo community, like those underlying differences don't get acknowledged or like brought up. And I think um, the global psychedelic community is, I think it's still to be determined, like, well, what do we want the psychedelic community to be? And are there differences? And I think there are an ecosystem differences in how people see the community approach emerging. So the reason I share that is not to say, well, there is no community. I think there is, but I still think the communities are still understanding and defining themselves because, like I said, people come to psychedelics for such a multitude of reasons and from different backgrounds and different political persuasions. And I do think sometimes, like, if I can harken back quick to the medical approach to contrast it with the community based approach, is that if someone has conflict or issues with like a therapist or like a clinic, there's like processes for that and like structure and like HR. And the community-based space has very little infrastructure or thinking, I think partially because it's still defining itself. And so the risk I foresee is that we have this community ecosystem that we call ourselves the psychedelic community ecosystem, but we haven't yet done the difficult work of people actually authentically naming what they see, what they think the ecosystem direction needs to go in, and acknowledging the differences in vision that there is for this space, I think. Not that we have those differences, but we might not. But I think that is actually the work of community. In order to earn that word community, and this is what this author talks about, you need to go through kind of a period of chaos where people acknowledge if people are going to authentically show up and have healthy attachment, they'd be like, well, actually, here's how I think of it. And people are like, wait a minute, that's not at all how I think about it. And then you realize, look, we have this shared interest in psychedelics, but we have. So I think community needs to be something that is earned. And I think the psychedelic ecosystem's like at a point where it's like we actually got to do that work. And I'm looking. It's not going to be easy, but I think it'll be very fruitful. So that's how I would relate to being in the global in this global psychedelic network. Is actually if I were to be bold, I think we're still in the kind of pseudo community stage, even though it's been 10 years. And I think it's great that this emergent practice has so many adherents around the world. But I think the work of, well, what does it mean, the global psychedelic community? I think that's a great question. And I can answer the second part later. I want to give Logina and Missy, you guys, a chance to respond or shoot down.
No, I'm sure, honestly, I'm sure a lot of what you just shared really um relates and resonates to a lot with Legina and a lot of your efforts, and probably resonates with the communities you're a part of. Legina, if you I'd love to hear more and share a little more about that.
Um, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's been um, going to these, having the privilege to go to these psychedelic conferences, like which has been my like intersection, this hub of meeting people from the larger community at large. I think um, it's so important. I think about even like communities interacting with each other interdependently, and like because what can we learn from other communities and how they're adapting to the specific subcultures they're operating within. Um, and I really appreciate being part of the Arab Psychedelic Society on an international scale, and I'm also and I think building those bridges and like learning from each other's experiences, especially as like this new wave of external facing psychedelic community is unfolding, is really critical. And I think once again, that's like why I'm hoping that through a public health approach and a systems approach, looking at how these communities intersect, we can contribute to like bringing folks together and creating greater cohesion and shared language and approaches. And I wanted to share that for Global Psychedelic Week, I'll be speaking on a panel, which I'm super excited about, on November 7th, the Queer Psychedelia Identity Healing Community and LGBTQ plus Spaces panel, which will be representative of folks from many different places and backgrounds. So I'll say, I think it's critical to be in conversation with folks, especially those coming from um, and bringing up again, like how are we centering um, like indigenous perspectives and voices and like redistributing power and all of those ways. So I'll stop there, but I think that especially now with social media and the different ways we're connecting and like also how interesting it is to be in New York City, which where so many parts of the globe converge and bring that perspective to like psychedelic community. Um, it's a critical part of the conversation, and I don't think one group has to do it all or like um
Yeah.
expected to.
Today on the podcast, we've talked, both Legina and I have talked a lot about public health. And I just want to share that it's really this intersection, public health and psychedelics, is what brought me to Brooklyn Psychedelic Society and Colin's vision for the future and community-based integration and his trellis framework. And we can't end this podcast without sharing with the world that's listening more about trellis and your vision for the future. And I would love for you to share a little bit about that before we wrap up today, Colin.
Sure. And Logina, I really enjoyed this conversation. I really hope we can do more of these. Um, and also love to, we can talk offline about, but love to learn more about Korean existentialism. I'm very impressed with what you've done with the community. Um, so in a nutshell, the longer term vision since 2020 has been a nationwide network of hopefully interconnected community-based healing centers, with acknowledging that these communities should have their own sovereignty over kind of their approach to it, but finding the kind of common denominator, unified needs around safety, access, and like effectiveness that these communities would kind of like need in order to hopefully like meet a baseline level of transformational potential or utility on like a kind of ecosystem level. Because in other words, I realize like even though the vision's community-based healing centers, we need to understand and think through and co-build what does community-based healing and transformation look like in practice. In other words, had a vision for the container, but I didn't know what the actual thing it was holding. And so that's when I had to do this pivot. It was like a little ego death because I was like waving the psychedelic co-op flag for so long, and I had this little voice being like, "Put the flag in the closet for now," and switch focus to Trellis. So Trellis, in a nutshell, is a framework that seeks to mobilize knowledge, to use a term Missy taught me, mobilize knowledge and resources and thinking around and develop best practices for the safety, affordability, and transformational potential of community-based psychedelic healing. So it outlines all the sorts of different programming we might need, as well as kind of community infrastructure that undergirds that programming. And I see two future like rollouts of Trellis, and we've done some framework development and some piloting of it here at BPS, but the two ways I see it is it's kind of both a mutual aid framework that we're hoping we can have everyone in this ecosystem contribute to and build towards, and it's open source and widely available that any community can use, and then potentially launching eventually a cooperative that uses the Trellis framework that people can be a member of to get peer support of throughout their psychedelic journey, whether underground with their friends abroad or legal if it's legal in their area. So yeah, it's a framework. Another a good analogy I've used to explain it is that like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, not everyone's cup of tea because it has a theological bent, but if someone were seeking treatment for alcoholism or other conditions that the 12 step addresses or helps with, they have the option to go to an expensive retreat center, which is, if you can afford it, can be helpful and great. But you'd be remiss to not let this person know that, hey, also just FYI, there's this free meeting that meets weekly. But the reason that I think it's been so successful is that it has the 12-step program, the 12-step framework that outlines the different stages of a spiritual transformation people go through. Trellis isn't exactly that, but it's kind of like undergirding the main aspects of a healthy, safe psychedelic journey, like discernment, preparation, journeying, processing, ongoing integration, and peer support. And then things like escalation protocols, community stewards, and again, it's meant to be a knowledge mobilizing framework. And if I can like link it briefly back to Logina's excellent question of how do we bring indigenous voices into this conversation, my top of mind idea for like Trellis, and comes from conversations I've had with people in the cooperative space and mutual aid space around the thinking behind it, is that we need to be, I think, authentically like, look, I'm a white Western male. I have 25% Lebanese in me, which is a cool little fact. But um, I, our structures, our social structures are very like horizontal, top down, lateral, and this community-based approach needs to be horizontal. And so I think it's more like akin to an indigenous approach from what I know of that, not being indigenous or native, of course, but like of that this is a horizontal thing where different voices need to be heard. And that's how I kind of see of integrating it with indigenous voices as well, as like, well, if we try to do it to the best of our ability and knowledge of like, well, how can we do this in a non-strictly Western autonomous top-down way? That's probably a good start for indigenous voices to be more heard and seen at the table, I would guess. If I can like link it back to where we last left off, but it's an open source framework for community-based healing that I hope one day will also have a cooperative element to it. So that's it in a nutshell.
I love that. And Legina, I know that there's a lot of that you can get behind here. And before we end today and wrap it up, I just want to hear from you. What's your vision for the future for community building in the psychedelic space?
Hmm. Wow, what a beautiful question. My my vision is um, going to seeing all the people who don't currently have community that is um, like a psychedelic community that is based in like harm reduction, education, resources, indigeneity, like lived experience, all the people who don't know that psychedelic community exists and haven't been reached, and coming up with, I guess, greater outreach and greater bridge building between um, communities that have a shared ethos, or where there's, um, you know, like for example, I made like psychedelics and healing from systems of oppression like zines and brought them to queer rating spaces where I knew people were, using psychedelics. And anyway, okay, this is a larger vision question, so there's a lot to say. But I would say building those bridges out, and doing a lot more collaboration, and also like using yeah, I and calling people in and learning what we can from people like Loretta Ross, who like is a restorative justice and reproductive justice educator and facilitator. Like, what does it mean to meet the moment and like lead the way as a community around what is possible in other communities regarding coming together, and building shared power rooted in respect and mutual accountability.
Mic drop to both of you. I couldn't agree more. And that's why we're all connected, because we share these synergies and our visions. It's
Well
amazing.
said, Logina. Yeah.
Yeah, very well said. Well, it looks like our time together has quickly come to an end. Thank you. Thank you so much to the both of you for this meaningful discussion. And my hope is that the collaboration future is really bright for all of us moving forward. And to all of you listening, thanks for tuning in. Brooklyn Psychedelic Society has some other events lined up during Global Psychedelic Week. So you can join us for an applied mycology course virtually on Tuesday, November 4th. We also have a Trip Tales Global Psychedelic Week special edition on Sunday, November 9th. Moving to Racket Club this time around. Later this month, we have a Rapé Circle on Friday, November 14th. And yet to be announced, so heard it here first. On Saturday, November 22nd, we're hosting the next rendition of our Synchronicity speaker series, exploring the medicine of connection, weaving Indigenous and Western wisdom for collective healing with a couple special guests. So stay tuned there. And then following that, we'll be hosting a community dinner. So keep your eyes peeled. And to close out the month, we'll have a virtual town hall on November 30th. So hope you can join us. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to both of you. This has been really great. I feel that there are many more podcast opportunities and collaborations ahead of us.
Thank you for joining us, Logina. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
hosting us, Missi.